In today's video, I'll be running you through a step-by-step process of how I make my black I don't even know how to say it. Kurinuki, probably. On how I make my black Kurinuki tea balls. As you can see here, I've measured out 5 separate balls of black clay, each weighing at about 1 kilogram. Usually I wouldn't weigh them so heavily for making a cup, but as I'm going to be carving a lot of it away, I'm going to need the body. Also, when making a lot of the same product, it's important to weigh it first, just to ensure that you have a consistency with the final product. Otherwise they're all going to look bigger than the others, or smaller, or wonkier. It's just, yeah, if you want them to look nice, weigh them, take the time, it's important. And as you can see, I am rolling the clay in on itself, which I believe is called wedging. I don't really know. And this, as far as I can tell, makes sure that it's the same consistency all the way through. The longer you take by doing these things, by like measuring them and wedging them together, the more likely your product's gonna come out nicer and also gonna work nicer on the wheel. That's me walking to my wheel, acting like I'm not filming myself. As you can see, my studio is just in my garage at home. I'm very lucky to have my own space to work in, where I don't have to pay extra rent at the moment. The water I'm using here, I've collected from a local river called the Uriara. I like to use this for all my pieces, just to make it feel like it's connected to the earth a little bit. Before throwing anything, I always wet the wheel first just a little bit to help the clay stick to the wheel. But you don't want it to be too wet. Otherwise it won't stick, it will slide everywhere. Sometimes when you throw the clay down as well, it doesn't land perfectly center, so it always helps to give it a bit of a knock to knock it into place. Now I'm moving really quick here, too quick for me to talk, but as you can see, I'm coning the clay up and then I'm forcing it back down into a puck kind of shape. Always ensuring that it's nice and wet. If it gets too dry, the clay will cling to your skin and make it go off center. This is really annoying, so I like to keep it nice and wet all the time. I use my left hand for guiding it and my right hand mostly for pushing it into place. It also helps to lean your body over the clay, I find, to use your upper body to help give your hands a bit more strength. And by bracing your arms or your elbows on your knees or on the side of the wheel, you also help to make your hands a lot more stable. The less your hands move, the less the clay will move. Now, as you can see here, I'm making sure it's staying wet. I've pushed my thumbs in to make a divot in the center. And then using them to pull it out to open up the center of the piece. And then using the sponge to help push the base down so it's nice and flat. This also helps the clay compact and become stronger on itself as well. Now here comes the first pull, using a wet sponge. I guide the clay up and inward to help it stop from fanning out. I use a plastic kidney to carve off a little bit from the bottom. That will help me to get the sponge underneath it on the next pull, as you can see. Pull it up again. Always kind of aiming slightly inside, or inward, when pulling it up, just to make sure it doesn't fan out. Because the clay's spinning, I don't know if you call it gravity or whatever, motion, it's always going to want to fan out. and you want to be in control of that whenever throwing. If it fans out too much, it's going to collapse, or it's just going to completely lose shape. You want to take it nice and slow. Right there, I just trimmed off a bit of the top because it was a bit wonky. This helps to just make it nice and even again on the top. And then I'm using the kidney again to push the clay out against it to make a nice, flat, even surface. Sorry, I'm moving really quick in this. I'm struggling to talk to keep up. Now I'm doing it again, from bottom to top, holding the kidney as still as possible, and just pushing the clay out against it. This will make sure it's nice and straight. Always keeping your fingers wet, your hands wet, clay wet. Now I'm measuring it just to make sure it's even. Always keeping a note of what the measurements are, either writing them down or keeping them in your head, just so every cup comes out the same. Now I'm just cleaning up the excess water inside to help it dry better once I finally take it off the wheel. Now here I'm using a wet sponge to smooth out the lip. It does help to do this while it's wet. I mean, you can always smooth it out at a later stage or even sand it down after it's been bisque fired. It's up to you. Usually the earlier you do things, the better. Now this is the next day. I've given the clay about 24 hours to dry. This is always going to be different depending on the weather. If it's cold and rainy, of course it's going to take a lot longer for the clay to dry out. If it's really hot, you could sometimes do it in the same day. First, before carving, I like to check the clay body just to see how thick it is on the base before I begin. Once I know what I'm working with, I start taking out chunks with the knife. Because it's quite thick on the bottom, I can be quite rough with it, as you can see. Of course, on the more delicate parts, you want to be a little more careful. But that's kind of the fun of it. Every time you're carving with a knife, it's a risk. You never know what you're going to get. You never know if you're going to completely screw up the product. At least in this video, I don't stuff it up. Not entirely. Now here I'm just slowly working towards making a base. Always keeping my fingers on the inside to feel how thin or how thick the clay body is. Once I've got somewhat of a foot going on here, I will do a rough circle, trusting that I know where the center is somewhat. You can measure it if you want. Sometimes I just can't be bothered, and it can be a bit more fun that way. Nice and exciting. Now once I'm somewhat happy with the shape of the foot, I'll chuck it down and start carving out the dead center. And once the foot's done, I start working on the side. The way I like to do it, as you can see, is just take it out chunk by chunk, usually long strips of it. And this is my design. I mean, you can do it differently. You might not even do it at all. As you can see, I just go one by one, and usually when you get to the other side, it will match up. If it's not perfect, it doesn't matter. That's kind of the whole idea of carving with the knife. It's always unpredictable. Some people are really into that. Some people can't stand it. Different depending on the day. But really, I just like carving clay with a knife. It's really satisfying. And most of the time, I'm happy with what I'm making. Now here I'm getting a bit closer to working the bottom and getting the final shape of the cup. I'm making sure I'm always checking how thick it is, because if you go too far you're going to put a hole in it, or it's just going to be too thin and it's not going to fire well. Technically, or from what I can tell, you want the clay to be somewhat the same thickness all the way through. The base is always going to be a bit thicker. Well, with anything that I'm making it is, and that's just the way it is, and usually that's turned out fine. Now, once I'm happy with the final shape, I'm going to grab my maker's mark and find an appropriate spot to stamp my symbol. And that's it. And once I'm done, always got to make sure to clean up the workspace, clean up any of the tools and sponges I've been using. There's nothing worse than going back into the shop the next day and starting work with a dirty workspace, or having to clean up before starting. I don't know, that's me. And anyway, usually after I'm done cleaning, it's time to feed the birds. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this video's helped. Hopefully they get better the more I make them. See you later.